Welcome to Worth Quoting, a program sponsored by the Women's Center of Florida Community College of Jacksonville. Our guest today is Dr. Dana Friedman, who is with the Conference Board, a business research organization. She is a senior research associate and has become a nationally recognized expert in the area of corporate child care. Dr. Friedman, we're so glad to have you with us this morning. Corporate child care is an area that has become quite an issue of discussion these days. I understand that you're here from a conference in Orlando where you spoke on that topic. You are speaking at a conference today here in Jacksonville and on your way to Los Angeles and then Minneapolis.
Right.
Why has corporate child care become such a topic of current discussion?
I think companies have begun to recognize the need for child care because if they're going to recruit a talented workforce and retain those workers, they're going to have to address the needs of the predominant number of workers out there. About 60% of mothers in the workforce currently have children under the age of 6. And a phenomenal number of women working have children under the age of 1. It's a very new phenomenon in the workplace. It used to be that men were working and women were at home. And as soon as women entered the workplace, the benefits and the work schedules that company had designed for those male breadwinners were no longer suitable for that diversity in their workforce. So companies are interested in providing child care because it can help them recruit and retain productive workers, perhaps reduce absenteeism and turnover, and increase productivity.
You mentioned the increase of women in the workplace. It's not, however, just a women's issue from what I read about. There seems to be a growing concern on the part of men, not just for their business benefits, but because they are experiencing problems in their own families with dealing with child care.
Absolutely. About 60% of men in the workforce have wives who are working full or part-time. So neither men nor women have wives at home taking care of their family responsibilities. There's a phrase I call the Kramerization of fathers from that movie several years ago, where men are taking a more active role in child rearing and family responsibilities. And when they begin to have to address both work problems and family problems, they feel the same stresses that women do. So it's just not a problem for women. You're absolutely right.
And it is a growing one. Well, I said it's a growing topic of discussion. In your travels around the country, are you seeing just discussion, or is there action that's being taken on corporate child care?
We're still in an education phase. I mean, the companies are still learning about the problem. They're still learning that there are ways for them to respond to those needs that they've identified. But there are now about 3,000 companies that have responded to the child care needs of their employees. There are 44,000 companies in the country with more than 100 employees, so I have a long ways to go. But as of 1982, only 600 companies were involved. So just in the last 4 years, there's been more than a 4-fold increase in corporate support for child care, and I expect it to continue to grow.
Can you do a comparison for us of how Florida ranks in comparison to other states or other parts of the country?
Florida, particularly areas like Jacksonville and Orlando, which are growing, are not unlike many other communities around the country, Baltimore and Norfolk and the like, that recognize with that growth and concerns about economic development and transportation services and building also come social service needs as more people populate that community. So that child care becomes more of a concern not only for the private sector but for the public sector. And there are public-private partnerships being developed as these communities expand to respond to the child care needs of community people. So I'd say that Florida right now is probably on par with some of these emerging communities. There are several other cities in the country which have already grown tremendously, where you have concentration of high technology firms like in Silicon Valley or the Research Triangle in North Carolina or at Route 128 in Boston. These communities have already grown, and indeed there are companies that have recognized if they want to recruit those talented workers, they'd better provide child care.
I have found, as I've been involved in doing research and talking with groups about corporate child care, that the first image that comes to most people's mind is a nursery down the hall from the CEO's office with children doing finger painting. Are we talking mostly about on-site daycare centers in businesses, or when you talk about the numbers of companies that have daycare, are you looking at the wide range of different kinds of assistance that they can provide their employees?
Among the 3,000 companies I mentioned, that includes companies providing any form of child care support. Of that 3,000, about 150 corporations have daycare centers on or near company premises. Another 400 hospitals have child care on or near the hospital, and about 50 government agencies at the city, county, and state levels offer child care services in a daycare center. The vast majority of employers, however, have chosen to help their employees buy into the existing system of child care. They're helping them find that care through information and referral services, or they're helping them pay for that care through discount programs or direct subsidies or something called flexible benefits.
I know another one of the perceptions that people have had when they hear about corporate child care is that it is a competitive system to private child care or the existing daycare centers in a community, and what you're saying indicates that that's not the situation at all. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of those options that you just mentioned and how they work?
Well, in the information and referral area, there are about 500 companies that contract with community-based organizations that typically keep computerized lists of all the daycare services in the community. Daycare centers, family daycare homes where neighborhood women take care of children in their own homes, sick child care services, after-school services, in-home nannies, whatever the needs of the community might be for child care, which are very diverse. That agency is supposed to know not only where they are, but how much they cost, what their hours are, whether there are openings, so that parents come to these agencies and not only get names of programs that suit their specific needs and those of their children, but it shortens their search time because they don't have to go to the yellow pages and call up a program that's got a waiting list of 100 children. In addition, these agencies typically help parents evaluate the programs that they visit. Quality is something that I don't think an undiscerning eye can tell what it really is, and there are some useful things that a parent can ask a director of a center or a family daycare provider about what their curriculum is and how they care for children and how often they can visit, which is a very important point, to help them figure out whether it's the kind of environment that they want their children in. So that ultimately, in the end, from a company perspective, it shortens the search time, and the parent may end up choosing more stable and reliable and satisfactory care, which means it disrupts their work life and their family life less often.
A wonderful service.
Yeah.
In addition to information and referral, you mentioned flexible benefits plans. Would you speak to that for just a minute?
Flexible benefits sounds very confusing to a lot of people. It's a function of tax laws that allow employers to offer employees a choice of benefits. It's called a cafeteria plan often, because companies say, okay, we'll give you some health and medical and disability and vacation, retirement, and child care, and eyeglasses, and legal assistance, and a variety of benefits that are somewhat unusual. And you pick those benefits that most suit your needs. So those with child care needs pick child care, and those who are older may want more retirement, and they choose retirement. They get a certain amount of money to select additional benefits. About 1,500 companies include the dependent care or child care option in their flexible benefits program. And it's very attractive to companies for two reasons. One is it solves the problem of equity. People can pick those benefits they need, so there isn't waste in benefits, but the employees who don't have children can get a benefit of equal value, so the company's not worried about a demand from employees without children. The second is that it's not very expensive, because the way that it's typically funded, a flexible benefits plan, is through something called salary reduction or salary redirection. If I make $30,000 and I have $3,000 in child care expenses, my employer gives me a $27,000 salary. I'm only taxed on $27,000, and I get $3,000 difference in pre-tax dollars. It's very valuable to me, and the company doesn't pay unemployment or Social Security tax on the amount of the $3,000 that's been reduced, so that there's an administrative cost that may offset that savings, but by and large, the company is offering a parent financial assistance for child care without paying for it. It's the tax system that covers the cost. So that's why it's very attractive, and among the 3,000 companies providing child care support, about half of them do so with a child care option and flexible benefits.
What a marvelous chance to have a benefit, not just to the employee, but to the employer, financial as well as social. Well, with that kind of range of options and with the need that exists, why aren't more companies doing a corporate child care program?
Well, there's a problem of information. I mean, they just don't know that it's out there or don't think they can do anything else but set up what they perceive to be as a very expensive daycare center that's going to disrupt the workplace. So there's an education, and I think the efforts of the Mayor's Commission on the Status of Women to hold the conference and the efforts of the community college and other services to educate the corporate community about both the need and the option is very critical. I think that, though, there's an attitudinal obstacle. It was okay for companies to provide that one set of benefits when we had one set of workers. It was also acceptable at that time to keep your personal problems at home. They don't belong at the office. And I think employees feel that as well, that the workplace is not really a conducive or a safe place to raise their concerns about child care. So employees are not speaking up about the problem. Companies don't think it's appropriate, and employees get that message and don't speak up about it, no matter how much they may be struggling to meet their child care needs and be productive workers. In addition, the vast majority of corporate decision makers are older men who had very different lifestyles than what the majority of workers now have. They came from that, what's now 10% of American families, with the male breadwinner nourishing the wife at home and 2.6 children, where the mother was home at 3 o'clock with cookies and milk for the kids. Fewer than 10% of families are like that today. So if management didn't experience the problem itself personally, and they're not hearing about it from employees, they remain insulated from the problem. So also employee pressure is a very important component to companies doing something. And I think that's why the motivations for recruitment and productivity concerns, are what's leading a lot of corporations into it. But absent a voice from the employees, there's still a resistance. They don't think it's an issue. And I think that's probably right now our biggest obstacle. One other problem is that childcare has been underfunded for years. It's just not a service that has gotten the attention that I think it's due. Now that the middle class needs childcare, perhaps there's greater attention. There's the interest on the part of other institutions in society, like the schools and businesses, to cooperate. But the fact is that if most companies are interested in helping their employees buy into the existing system by helping them find care or pay for care, and there's no system out there, there's very little companies can do. They don't want to build daycare centers. I mean, some do, and where I work, they're terrific, but it's not for everybody. So they're left saying, okay, I recognize this need, but I can't afford to build the child care system in this community. I'd like to expand it, I'd like to improve it, I'd like to make sure it's of higher quality, but if there's nothing that I can buy into to do that, it becomes difficult. So the pattern of employer support nationally is not only where there's economic health and a presence of high growth industries that have these recruitment needs, it's also where there's a sophisticated supply of child care services that make it easy for companies to buy into the system. I call it the M&M theory of employer supported child care. No mess, no fuss. Let them get involved so that they're not in the business of child care, and they shouldn't be. There's a community group of experts out there who know how to run good programs. Let them package a kind of services that companies can use to make sure their employees get the services they need.
Really takes a very broad range of partnerships in a community,
Absolutely.
doesn't it?
There's just no one sector that can respond to the vast need of child care alone. And I think there's a lot we can look to the private sector to do, startup funds and contributing to some programs, but there's got to be some government support, and United Way and universities and the public schools all involved to meet the need, because it's just that great. And good quality care is expensive.
And ought to be there.
Yes.
You alluded to some of the payoffs that a company may decide that they want to opt for, such as recruiting, for instance, or turnover reduction. What are you finding as you look nationally at companies that are trying various kinds of corporate child care? What are the payoffs or the benefits that they get?
There are 3 national studies of companies with child care programs. They're mostly the daycare centers, because the research was done several years ago, and that's what the small number of companies involved were doing. And that research, however, identified the fact that between 60 and 80% of the companies providing child care support felt that the provision of a child care program improved absenteeism and turnover and tardiness and morale and loyalty and productivity. And now this research is based on the beliefs of managers. This wasn't the kind of controlled study that watched it over a long period of time. They just surveyed managers, and are you finding that these improvements in management problems occurred? And they all said yes. There was one study that Control Data did back in the late 70s. They sponsored a daycare center with 13 other companies in Minneapolis called the Northside Child Development Center. And they did one of these very interesting controlled studies. They had 30 employees who were using the company-sponsored daycare center, 30 employees who had other child care arrangements, and 30 employees that didn't have children. And they compared their absenteeism and turnover rates. And indeed, they found that the 30 employees using the company-sponsored center had far less absenteeism and turnover than did the other two groups combined. The research that's emerging now is even more interesting because it's not surveying companies with child care programs. It's serving employees in companies that don't have any child care support. So it shows what a company loses by not responding rather than what a company saves by responding. And when you ask an employee, how often have you been late because of child care problems? How often have you been absent? How much stress are you feeling because of child care? How often has your career been interrupted because of the child care problems you've been unable to resolve? You get some very, very interesting data that I think is very telling to a corporation, especially when employees aren't speaking up about the problem. So these kinds of community-wide surveys, they've been done in Kansas City and Portland and Washington, D.C., and parts of New Jersey and Boston, with multiple companies contributing to the survey. You get a very clear picture of what the absence of child care support is doing to the productivity levels of workers. And there you're finding between 30 and 60% of employees are saying that they experience work-family conflict that causes them stress and reduced productivity. They generally feel that some form of company support would be very helpful in ameliorating that problem.
Maybe a next step that we need to do here in Jacksonville is that kind of community survey so that we have more specific data to respond to.
There's enormous education that goes on with the results of those kinds of studies, and I think more importantly, you give a voice to the employee need out there that's not being expressed at the workplace.
Yes. We were fortunate to have with us last spring Jim Wiley of Nylon Craft in Mishawaka. I was going to ask if you were familiar with his daycare center, a 24-hour center. And it was interesting to hear him speak about the payoff or the benefit to his company. He sees that they may be breaking even this year for the first time after 2 or 3 years. But a real excitement that he had about the reduction in turnover, the reduction in the costs for training new employees, money that they saved because they didn't have equipment broken by new employees, and a number of areas that were things that had not occurred to me at any rate.
Well, Jim Wiley of Nylon Craft has done a wonderful service to this field because he's one of the few CEOs who will speak out about the issue. And that's one of the interesting things about the research and why there isn't enough of it to substantiate the bottom line effects on childcare. Every company that is thinking about starting a childcare program needs the data to show that it's going to yield a return on investment. Most companies with child care already implemented really don't want to spend the time or money to research its effects. It's very rare for a company to take away a benefit once it's provided. So unless employees are screaming this is terrible and we don't like it, which is very rare, they're satisfied with continuing the program as is without conducting the research that's needed. So it's very hard to find a work site to do the research in to evaluate how effective it's been in yielding these productivity returns.
And those kinds of yields are not things that would happen right away.
Oh, they're long term. That's exactly right, and that's why it's fairly expensive research. Most of the companies providing child care support also provide an array of other very supportive benefits. They have fitness centers and they have counseling programs and flex time and a variety of things, because these are the kinds of companies, the forward thinking, who know that their employees are more than just workers. They're people with other needs and stress reduction programs and whatever. How can you, if you do a research study, how can you say that it's child care that's causing the change in behavior when it may be one of a variety of other programs? So in order to single out what portion of the change is really child care related, you need a very controlled study with lots of control groups and experimental designs, and methodologically it's very difficult research to conduct and long-term and expensive.
I would imagine. I mentioned Jim Wiley's center. Can you think of other centers or examples in comparable cities of companies that have put in a corporate child care program that are sort of unusual or unique?
Yeah. One that I think is interesting that may actually have some utility for Jacksonville, given its growth, is a consortium arrangement where several companies got together and created a daycare center in downtown Atlanta. Now this center is housed within a department store that was cutting back a little, and they had some extra space. So the store provided the space, and the companies each contributed about $20,000 or $30,000 to get the equipment and hire the architects to renovate the space to suit licensing standards. And then they provide about $5,000 a year, each of the 6 companies participating, on an ongoing basis, and parent fees cover most of the other operating expenses. But there's where they recognized a need, and there was no one company that could afford to create the center on its own, so a number of companies got together to collaborate. There was even some government money invested in the beginning to hire the consultants to pull the companies together. So it was really quite a partnership. It's right in the heart of downtown. It works very nicely.
How smart for a department store as well, with parents coming in and
Absolutely.
out delivering children.
Absolutely.
They could get some real benefit.
I think some of the other interesting programs are occurring in industrial parks and in some new industrial areas where, again, numbers of employers are located in one space, so you have an expanded labor pool from which to draw, so you make sure that the center is well used, but you also have a developer who's willing to allot the space. And Rouse & Company has started 3 daycare centers in 3 of its new harborside developments, and I understand there's one in Jacksonville.
You're right.
And I don't know what the plans are, but there's a perfect opportunity, especially with large corporations located nearby, where it's convenient for employees. There are enough of them around to make sure the center's utilized, but the space is available. And those kinds of programs are very innovative and very new, but make a lot of sense because there's a shared cost.
I was excited when you had mentioned that to me earlier in discussion, and that project is in the process of being built right now, so we'll have to do some checking and see what the plans are.
Right, right. I think one of the other things that's very interesting that companies are beginning to become aware of is that there are a variety of needs out in the child care field. It may be that the system doesn't have enough supply, that the care just isn't as available as it should be. It may be that parents can't afford it, in which case affordability is the issue. They can't find it, it's accessibility, it may not be of good quality. And that whatever a company can do, they've got to look at the community market. Is it affordability? Is it accessibility? Is it availability? Is it quality? That's the major problem. And invest in the system to keep each of those aspects of the child care market up to snuff. And IBM is a corporation that established a nationwide referral system, but they realized that if they're in a community where there isn't enough care, all the referrals in the world isn't going to get the parents the care they want because there just isn't enough of it. So they made a simultaneous commitment to expanding the supply of care as they refer their employees to it. So they paid people in these local community referral agencies to recruit and train and license new providers of service. They've created over 5,000 new child care programs within a year across this country, not just for IBM employees. So it's helped the whole community at the same time.
That's exciting. You may be aware that we, just in the last week, opened a new daycare center here in Jacksonville at the YWCA, which I think is a good example of some of the kind of partnerships that you've mentioned here, because the City of Jacksonville, the Y Episcopal Child Care Centers, and Lutheran Social Services have all been involved together in getting that going. And it's in a location downtown that's very convenient for employees and other businesses around to take advantage of.
Right, and I think that, you know, in approaching companies to, if they need to expand or they need some supply, maybe even donations of supply and equipment, is a very important function of the private sector in helping child care become better quality. There may be some people who can't afford that center if it's of high quality, and some of the flexible benefits programs or direct subsidies through vouchers could be very interesting for local companies who find a lot of their employees using that program.
What recommendation would you make to a company right now who's saying, I'm interested in this, this is something that I ought to look into? What should they do first?
Probably hold a press conference would be very nice, but they don't do that until the program's open. But you need some corporate spokespeople to say that this is good and that they've done it. And Amory Houghton, former chairman of the board of Corning Glass, once said that 1% of all companies want to be first and 99% want to be second. You just need that one company and cultivate them to become a John Wiley who's willing to, to go out and speak about it. But I think what that company needs to do is figure out what's the most appropriate option for them. What is it that the company wants out of the program? If it's a lot of visibility, a daycare center may be the best thing they can do, and call it, the ABC, Development Corporation Childcare Center. It's easier to take a picture of a daycare center than it is of a referral system. So it'll get you more publicity, perhaps, depends on the coverage. But the company's got to be clear on what it wants out of the program. The second thing they need to do is look at what their own employees want. They may have an older workforce, have school-age children, and it's after-school programming that's the biggest problem. The company may be suffering from high absenteeism rates, and they find that there are no sick child care services. So you've got to match the specific needs of that employee population. Where they commute from is very important, since an on-site center may be totally useless if they're all relying on public transportation or commute such long distances they don't want to bring their 2- and 3-year-olds with them. And finally, what it is the community's got. It's silly for a company to duplicate an already existing service that just needs to be expanded or improved upon so that it can serve employees of that company. So it's those three components that the company should look at: what it needs, what its employees need, and what the community needs, to really figure out what's the best option. And then, of course, all of this is considered in the range of costs and benefits and the like. But with that examination, they should be able to come up with something that's appropriate for their own community. And as a result, there are no two companies that have done exactly the same thing. None of the 3,000 companies, I can say there's general categories of response, but they're all fashioned and paid for and cost very different things depending on the particular needs of that company, parent, population, and community.
Very creative area.
Yes,
for
it is.
Innovation, yes.
Right, it's challenging.
One of the things that I hope we can make obvious to companies who might be interested locally is that there are local resources to help them. With HRS daycare office, the City of Jacksonville has a daycare office. There are companies that have done some needs assessments who are willing to share that with other places. Baptist Medical Center is one, for instance, that could help a company that's looking for what they might do for themselves in the area of corporate child care.
Absolutely.
Dr. Friedman, this has been so interesting, and we appreciate so much your being with us. You've given us lots of food for thought and ideas for us to take back and see what we can do with, and we hope you'll be back soon so that we can report to you some of the exciting developments in corporate child care here in Jacksonville.
Thank you.
And we are glad to have had our audience with us on Worth Quoting, a program sponsored by the Women's Center of Florida Community College of Jacksonville.